In Ethiopian history and the Ras Tafari movement, Haile Selassie I, the Emperor of Ethiopia from 1930 to 1974, was a significant figure. He came to power in 1916 as the Empress Zututu's regent plenipotentiary. As a member of the Solomonic dynasty, which can trace its ancestry back to Emperor Menelik I, he is considered a significant person among Rastafarians. Through political and social reforms, such as the outlawing of slavery and the adoption of Ethiopia's first written constitution in 1931, Haile Selassie pushed modernization. He made an attempt, but Ethiopia was taken over by Italy, which resulted in his banishment to England. After his return in 1941, he battled against secession by dissolving the Ethiopia-Eritrea Federation. In 1963, Haile Selassie co-founded the Organization of African Unity, demonstrating his strong involvement in international politics. He was ousted and then assassinated in 1974. He was a devoted Christian even though some Rastafarians saw him as a messiah. On November 1, 1905, Tafari's father named him the Dajazmak of Gari Melada when he was 13 years old. Keeper of the Door, or Dajazmak, was a title of nobility akin to that of a count. He was proclaimed regent plenipotentiary and crown prince on September 27, 1916, and on February 11, 1917, he took on the name Ras Tafari Makonnen. Ras, which means head, denoted a noble status comparable to that of a duke or prince. He was given the title of Negus, which means king, in 1928, without any geographical restrictions. After the death of Empress Zudota, Tafari assumed the regnal name Haile Selassie I on November 2, 1930, and became the Negusa Nagast, or emperor. In Ge'ez, Haile meant power of, while Selassie meant Trinity, meaning power of the Trinity. Known by several names, including as Janhoy Talakumari and Abatakal, Haile Selassie was regarded as Jah Rastafari, and his imperial majesty by the Rastafari movement. Haile Selassie, who was born in Ejer-Sogoro, Ethiopia, on July 23, 1892, claimed ancestry from Menelik I, the son of ruler Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and was descended from the Shewanamhera Solomonic ruler. A surgeon and a Capuchin priest taught Tafari and his cousin Emperor Haile Selassie about horror. When Tafari's father died in 1906, he was made Dejazmak, which is the equivalent of a count, at the age of 13. In 1907, he was appointed governor of Selayel, and then took on the role of governor of a portion of Sidamo while still attending school. Princess Romanwork is Tafari's daughter, who is thought to have been born in his late teens when he wed Waziru al-Tayak. In 1910 or 1911, Tafari was named governor of Harar following the death of his brother Yelma in 1907. On August 3, 1911, Meninus Favram Basil and he were married. Tafari was a major player in the movement that overthrew Lij Ayesu and installed Empress Zutatu in her stead. Tafari assumed the roles of regent plenipotentiary and crown prince. While Zutatu held the position of empress, he de facto took over as ruler of the Ethiopian Empire. Zutatu's coronation on February 11, 1917, cemented Tafari's position as her regent. Although Tafari seemed to be in the spotlight more, Zutatu was ultimately in charge and had significant influence. Daily administrative issues were Tafari's responsibility, but his limited power meant that he was frequently unable to overcome the combined power of the empress, the minister of war, and the provincial governors. Tafari carried on Menelik II's cautious modernizing program during his regency. The 1918 flu epidemic also escaped him. He pledged to end slavery in 1923 in order to gain Ethiopia's admittance to the League of Nations, even though the practice continued in spite of earlier declarations. In 1924, Tafari set off on a journey through Europe and the Middle East with prominent individuals. Despite not being able to achieve his major objective of getting to the sea, he examined a number of establishments and continued to be wary of pressure from Europe. Tafari and his group attracted a lot of attention and were warmly received wherever they went. The actor was also a huge fan of the media sensation, adopted the unique clothing and oriental dignity of the Ethiopian delegation. In exchange for accepting the imperial crown of Emperor Tawadros II, Tafari even gave gifts of lions. This journey made a lasting effect and gave rise to many stories. At this time, the crown prince adopted 40 Armenian children who had been harmed during the Armenian genocide, which was a noteworthy act of humanitarianism. Together with them, he founded the imperial brass band and gave them instruction in music. In 1928, Tafari encountered opposition to his rule upon the arrival of Dejazmik Balcha Safo in Addis Ababa, accompanied by a sizable military force. Tafari consolidated his authority over the provinces in the face of resistance from Menelik's old appointments. The governor of the province of Sidamo, Balcha Safo, presented a special issue because he misrepresented his revenue. When Tafari summoned him back to Addis Ababa, Balcha Safo treated Tafari disrespectfully. Empress Zutatu attempted to accuse Tafari of treason because of his interactions with Italy, which included a peace agreement, but Tafari eventually succeeded in unseating him and holding on to power. Reactionaries in the palace tried to topple Tafari in September, but their attempt was unsuccessful. Tafari continued to have the backing of both the populace and the police, which resulted in his coronation on October 7, 1928. Since Tafari and the Empress shared the same territory, something that had never happened in Ethiopian history, the coronation caused controversy. Ras Tafari's uprising was sparked by the dissatisfaction of conservatives. Nevertheless, Tafari was vanquished, and the abrupt demise of Empress Zutatu in April 1930 coincided with the announcement of his loss. Following the demise of Zutatu, Tafari assumed the throne and was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia. On November 2, 1930, he was crowned, and dignitaries from all around the world attended. Large sums of money were spent on the event, and many guests were given expensive presents. Numerous sources, including American travel professor Burton Holmes and British author Evelyn Waugh, provided documentation of the event. Tafari's transition from regency to becoming Emperor Haile Selassie, a pivotal character in Ethiopian history, culminated with these events. A bicameral legislature was founded by Haile Selassie's introduction of Ethiopia's first written constitution on July 16, 1931. It kept the nobility in power, but it also established democratic norms among them, aiming for a democratic transition to rule when the populace was able to choose its own representatives. But other dynastic princes, like as those from Tigray and his obedient cousin, Ras Haile Darge, opposed the clause restricting the throne's succession to Haile Selassie's lineage. After Sultan Abba Jafar II passed away in 1932, Ethiopia formally absorbed the Sultanate of Jimma. In the 1930s, Ethiopia was once again the focus of Italian colonial aspirations. The fascist government of Benito Mussolini sought retribution for Italy's previous setbacks and attempted to obliterate memories of the abortive conquest of Ethiopia. Ethiopia was viewed by Italy as a link between the Italian Somaliland and Eritrean territories. Ethiopia was a member of the League of Nations. However, the League was of no use when Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935. The appeasement policies of the League's allies towards Italy were made public by the Horleval Pact affair. In retaliation, Haile Selassie gathered his army in Dis and issued a command to stave off the Italian assault. In his mobilization order, he cautioned against inaction and underlined the significance of protecting Ethiopia. In addition, the decree provided exemptions for products sold to the armed forces and emphasized the importance of supporting the troops. On October 19, 1935, Haile Selassie's resolve to protect Ethiopia from Italian assault signaled the beginning of a significant period in his rule. Haile Selassie gave clear instructions to Ras Kassa, his commander-in-chief, stating that tents were to be erected in caves, next to trees, and in the forests, with a 30-cubit space between each tent. Troops traveling through valleys, trenches, and zigzag routes with trees and woodlands for cover should evade open roads and meadows when they notice airplanes. Soldiers carrying specified weapons should fire a synchronized volley as soon as an airplane lowers to deliver bombs, and spread out swiftly. The plane can be brought down by a few blows. Soldiers should stay carefully dispersed until the plane is a respectable distance away in order to prevent being discovered when it rises again. To stop enemy fire during a fight, it is advisable to wear unnoticeable clothing and stay away from valuables. Haile Selassie tells his warriors that he is prepared to give his life in order to free Ethiopia, saying decorations can be worn afterwards. The Italian invasion of Ethiopia started in October 1935 while the war was developing, but the Ethiopian forces mounted a victorious Christmas offensive in November that put the Italians on the defensive. However, the Ethiopian army were ultimately defeated in succeeding encounters including Amba Aradam, Tembian, and Shire. At the Battle of Mechu, Haile Selassie himself launched a counterattack, but he was ultimately vanquished. Haile Selassie made the perilous journey to the churches at Lalibela for prayer and fasting as the situation grew desperate. The imperial family left for French Somaliland and later Jerusalem. After the government made the decision to move to Gore in order to ensure their safety and the imperial house's preservation, following much discussion, it was decided that Haile Selassie should go into exile with his family and represent Ethiopia at the League of Nations in Geneva. Nobleman Bladatakul Wolde Hawariat, who took issue with an Ethiopian king escaping an invading troop, was among those who opposed the judgment. On May 2, 1936, Haile Selassie named his cousin, Ras Imre, Haile Selassie as Prince Regent and left with his family for French Somaliland. Days later, on May 5th, Italian troops under Marshal Pietro Badoglio entered Addis Ababa, and Mussolini proclaimed Ethiopia a province of Italy. Because of the Solomonic dynasty's claim to the House of David, the Ethiopian exiles made the symbolic decision to travel to Jerusalem on board the British cruiser HMS Enterprise, departing from French Somaliland. In order to avoid giving the UK government a state reception, Haile Selassie and his party sailed from Jerusalem on the British cruiser HMS Cape Town to Gibraltar, where he stayed at the Rock Hotel before switching to an ordinary liner. On May 12, 1936, Haile Selassie gave a speech to the League of Nations following Italy's withdrawal of a delegation. The Italian journalists were driven out of the hall despite jeers from the galleries. With grace and dignity, Haile Selassie spoke in Amharic, condemning Italy for using chemical weapons on his people, while European nations turned away Ethiopia's humanitarian requests. Recognizing the enormous power differential between his small nation of 12 million people and Italy's 42 million, he disclosed the Italian command's practice of aerial spraying, causing a deadly rain to systematically destroy living species and contaminate the land and water. Haile Selassie, armed with lethal weapons, underlined that, in the absence of collective action, aggression threatened and made all tiny governments vassals. He forewarned the League of Nations that God and history would remember their judgment. He emphasized the significance of treaty signings, international morality, and collective security. Though the League only imposed light penalties on Italy, it was widely praised by anti-fascists and voted Man of the Year by Time in 1935. Haile Selassie lived at Fairfield House and painstakingly wrote his life biography while in exile in Bath, England. He also spent brief stays in Wimbledon and Worthing, and a blue plaque in Malvern was erected in his honor. Haile Selassie aggressively resisted Italian propaganda during this time by disclosing the actual level of Ethiopian resistance and the illegal occupation. He fiercely decried the crimes committed against Ethiopian residents and the vandalism of historical artifacts and religious institutions, including the theft of an imperial obelisk dating back 1600 years. Haile Selassie conveyed his steadfast faith in divine justice, which would ultimately hold the powerful and the vulnerable accountable, and he lobbied for League involvement. Even though he had trouble at first getting backing from other countries, African American groups in the U.S. who were sympathetic to Ethiopian issues were moved by his appeals. Haile Selassie persisted in the face of personal misfortunes, including the death of family members. Following his return to Ethiopia, he presented memorial blue plaques in Bath and Weston-super-Mare and kindly donated Fairfield House as an assisted living facility. In order to liberate Ethiopia in the 1940s and 1950s, Haile Selassie worked with South African and African forces that were supported by Ethiopia. Imperial declarations were made, emphasizing the solidarity of the emperor's public support and British military might. Haile Selassie entered Ethiopia in January 1941 and joined the Gideon force that was already there. Italy was beaten by Ethiopian nationalists. The United Kingdom, the Commonwealth of Nations, Free France, and Free Belgium, working together. Haile Selassie spoke to the Ethiopian people once more on May 5, 1941, focusing on unification and peace. Ethiopia joined the UN as a founding member during World War II, and the Federation of Eritrea into Ethiopia was founded in 1950. Haile Selassie pushed progressive tax plans and the autocephaly of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, in spite of obstacles to change. In 1959, the Abuna was elevated to the position of Patriarch Catholicos. When the Harare Muslims of Harar and their friends from Somalia began a major uprising against the empire in 1948, the state retaliated violently. The entire town of Harar was placed under house arrest after a number of arrests were made. The people's estates and possessions were taken over by the government, which caused a massive and unprecedented migration of Hararis from the Harari region. The unfulfilled promise of limited autonomy for Harar, made by Menelik II following his conquest, was the root of the Harari discontent, which was progressively undermined by Amhara governors after him. According to historians Tim Carmichael and Roman Loimier, Haile Selassie was personally involved in putting an end to the Harari movement, which had been started in reaction to the persecution of Hararis, who had assisted the Italians in their 1935–1941 occupation of Ethiopia. In keeping with his commitment for collective security, Haile Selassie sent General Mulugata Bule's Kagnub Italian contingent to aid the UN command during the Korean War. In an address in 1954, Haile Selassie praised Ethiopia's involvement in the Korean War as a rededication to the collective security principles, reiterating his conviction that his conduct was appropriate and expressing appreciation for the principles' validation through their combined action in Korea. Haile Selassie presented a revised constitution in November 1955 during the Silver Jubilee festivities. This constitution extended political involvement by creating an elected lower chamber of parliament, but it still preserved his effective power. Party politics, however, were left out of the framework. Prioritizing the adoption of contemporary teaching techniques, the nation started planning for growth and modernization, while incorporating Ethiopian customs into the state's historic monarchical framework. Haile Selassie tried to strengthen ties with different ethnic groups, while reaching agreements with traditionalists in the church and nobility. Those who dared to take control of distant territories were granted autonomy. However, the sluggish pace of reforms and concessions given to the powerful nobility hindered his attempts to put an end to feudalism. The 1955 Constitution was updated, however it has come under fire for strengthening the unquestionable authority of the monarch while granting peasants very little control. Haile Selassie kept friendly ties with the United Kingdom by doing altruistic acts. In 1947, amid a period of severe floods, he sent a letter to the National Distress Fund offering assistance to the British government. He gave the British government Fairfield House, his home in exile, in 1959. In Bath, to the Bath City for the elderly's welfare. There was little awareness in Addis Ababa throughout the 2 years of a terrible famine that struck the Tigray province in northern Ethiopia in the summer of 1958. When the Ministry of Interior learned of the mass killings in September 1959, the central government made the announcement and requested assistance. The United States supplied 32,000 tons of humanitarian grain to be delivered in Tigray and Eritrea, while the emperor personally donated 2,000 tons. By the time the famine ended in August 1961, over 100,000 people had already died, despite attempts due to disease outbreaks, hailstorms, locust infestations, and drought. Haile Selassie faced an abortive coup attempt in the 1960s while providing Ethiopian troops to the UN peacekeeping mission in the Congo. Along with his support for African decolonization, he opposed European attempts to rule Eritrea independently, which resulted in the disintegration of the Federation and the beginning of the country's independence movement in 1961. Haile Selassie attended the Conference of Non-Aligned Countries in 1961, which is regarded as the Non-Aligned Movement's founding conference, in Belgrade. Tensions between Ethiopian forces and Eritreans seeking independence erupted into the Eritrean War of Independence. Despite a vote by Eritrea's parliament to join Ethiopia, the struggle lasted for 30 years. Haile Selassie was elected as the Organization of African Unity's (OAU) inaugural chairperson in 1963 and was instrumental in the organization's founding. He supported the idea of the United States of Africa as well. In his speech to the UN, Haile Selassie emphasized the need of peaceful cohabitation and the idea of collective security. He met with President Johnson and went to the funeral of President Kennedy. His 1966 attempt to impose a progressive income tax system was met with opposition, which led to a revolution. Haile Selassie applauded the United States for its civil rights laws but denounced the Vietnam War and supported UN-approved collective security activities. World leaders praised Haile Selassie when he traveled to Montreal, Canada in 1967 to open the Ethiopian Pavilion at Expo 67 World's Fair. The 1960s and 1970s presented difficulties due to student unrest and the development of communism among the intelligentsia. Land reform initiatives were hampered by opposition from conservative groups and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which also tarnished the government's standing and inflamed peasant anger. Haile Selassie prioritized foreign policy, while giving Prime Minister Akhlelu Habt Volda control over domestic concerns. He continued to have international renown despite obstacles at home by participating in important occasions like summits and state funerals. He met important dignitaries while traveling to China and Italy. Under Haile Selassie's leadership, human rights suffered from restricted civil liberties and political rights. The 1972-1974 famine in the Wallo and Tigray regions led to a large number of fatalities and an infusion of relief, which helped destabilize the rule of Haile Selassie. Under these conditions, a faction of rebel army officers launched a slow-motion coup against Emperor Haile Selassie's collapsing regime. They came up with a scheme to take advantage of the public's ongoing adoration for the emperor. They obtained a DVD of the movie The Unknown Famine, which they retitled The Hidden Hunger, by cutting in video showing Haile Selassie enjoying a sumptuous wedding feast at his castle. On Ethiopian television, this ominous movie aired non-stop on the day the officers plucked up the confidence to take the emperor. Various accounts diverge about Haile Selassie's awareness or ignorance of the severity of the famine. Haile Selassie's downfall and Mengistu, Haile Mariam's ascent were caused by a popular rebellion sparked by the revelation of corruption and the Kremlin's portrayal of Ethiopia as being behind the times. The government's support was further undermined by the economic crisis, which was exacerbated by military mutinies and rising oil costs. When protests broke out in February 1974, the emperor had to address the country, but the unrest continued. Ultimately, on September 12, 1974, a group of military commanders known as the Derg took advantage of the unrest in the government and removed Haile Selassie. His family members were detained, and he was placed under house arrest. In the closing months of his life, Haile Selassie continued to believe that he was still the emperor, and former officials were put to death without a trial. With this, the Solomonic dynasty came to an end. Haile Selassie passed away on August 27, 1975. The cause of death was declared to be respiratory failure, brought on by complications after a prostate exam and surgery. Nevertheless, contradictory reports surfaced. Dr. Asrat Waldyes refuted the government's account, claiming that Haile Selassie had been in excellent health and denying any difficulties. Former military officers were convicted in 1994 of 1975's emperor's strangulation while he was in bed, accompanied by documents that disclosed a top-level directive from the military regime to kill Haile Selassie for heading a feudal regime. They were accused of genocide and murder. The validity of these documents has been verified by evidence, such as the official seal and signatures of the regime. Haile Selassie's remains were found on the palace grounds in 1992, hidden beneath a concrete slab. Haile Selassie's funeral was conducted by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church on November 5, 2000. However, the government chose not to designate it an official imperial funeral. His casket was positioned in Bada Church, close to the grave of his great-uncle, Menelik II. Even though well-known Rastafari individuals like Rita Marley attended, many Rastafari disapproved of the gathering, contesting the veracity of the bones and doubting if Haile Selassie had actually passed away in 1975. Princess Tenegnuark, Crown Princess Fawasan, Princess Zenabuark, Princess Tsehai, Prince Makonnen, and Prince Salah Selassie were the parents of 6 of Haile Selassie's children. Haile Selassie's descendants have been embroiled in public issues, such as the 2017 auction of his $2.9 million Patek Philippe watch. Some adherents of the Rastafari movement, which had its start in Jamaica in the 1930s as a result of Leonard Howell's influence, an African redemption movement supporter, honor Haile Selassie as God incarnate. He is regarded as the Messiah who will bring liberation to the African people and the African diaspora. Known by names such as King of Kings of Ethiopia and Conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, his ancestry is thought to have originated with Solomon and Sheba. Rastafaris regard him as the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the Conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, and the Root of David, and they view these beliefs as the fulfillment of prophecies found in the Book of Revelation. As soon as word of Haile Selassie's coronation reached Jamaica, the Rastafari community began to believe that he was a heavenly incarnation. A group from Jamaica, including of leaders who were both Rastafari and non-Rastafari, visited Ethiopia in 1961 to talk with the emperor about repatriation and other issues. This was primarily through stories published in Time magazine. They could count on Haile Selassie's support for the cause of repatriation. Later, on April 21, 1966, he traveled to Jamaica, where he was greeted by some 100,000 Rastafaris. Haile Selassie was able to step down from the plane when the throng was subdued by renowned Rasta leader Ras Mortimer Plano, despite the initial turmoil. Coronation Day is observed on this day, which is significant to the Rastafari movement. He also gave them advice, coining the expression liberation before repatriation, to wait to leave for Ethiopia until they had freed the people of Jamaica. Haile Selassie's deference to Rastafari persisted, and he encouraged the founding of the Ethiopian Church in the Caribbean. Rita Marley, the spouse of Bob Marley, became a Rastafari when she saw Haile Selassie in Jamaica. She furthered her conviction in his messianic character by claiming to have seen marks on his hand that resembled stigmatas. Due to Bob Marley's fame, Haile Selassie's affiliation with the Rastafari movement became more well-known. Haile Selassie refuted claims of divinity in a 1967 interview, saying he was mortal and that the next generation will take his place. Some Rastafaris, on the other hand, understand his words differently, acknowledging but not refuting his divine character. To the Ethiopian World Federation for the Settlement of People of African Descent, who had aided Ethiopia in the war, Haile Selassie gave land in Shashamane, Ethiopia, in 1948. Though land allocation has caused tensions with the local population, Rastafari families settled in Shashamane and formed a community that still exists today. Haile Selassie's involvement in the Rastafari movement, his visit to Jamaica, and his treatment of Rastafaris have had a significant impact on the faith and its adherents.